In this lesson, we're going to discuss ports and protocols. In security, one of the most important things is for you to ensure that you understand what openings you've created inside of your computer systems. When it comes to computers and networks, most of these openings are going to be created using the concept of an open port. Now, a port is simply a logical communication endpoint that exists on your computer or server. For example, if you're running a secure web server that's used for e-commerce on your system, you're going to have port 443 open and listening for any inbound requests from your potential visitors. Now, ports are going to be classified as either inbound or outbound ports. An inbound port is used when a computer or server is listening for a connection. Just as in my earlier example, our web server had port 443 open and listening for a connection. That is an inbound port. It's just sitting there and waiting for somebody to come along and connect to it. Now, an outbound port, on the other hand, is going to be opened by a computer whenever it wants to connect to a given server. If my computer is attempting to make a connection to your web server over port 443, then my computer is actually going to open up a random high number port like port 52363, and then it's going to make an outbound request to your web server using your port 443. Now, what does all this look like out in the real world? Well, let's say we have an example of an inbound and outbound port that's going to be used when my laptop attempts to connect to a remote server over SSH, which is the Secure Shell Protocol. Now, first, we're going to have a server that has a public IP address assigned to it that's listening on port 22. So port 22 is going to be our inbound port awaiting a new connection. In this case, port 22 will be open, awaiting for that connection to occur. Now, I also have my laptop, and it's the one that wants to make that connection. My laptop is going to be assigned a private IP address because my network is using network address translation at the router, and this gives me additional protections inside of my network. Now, notice at this point, my laptop doesn't have any ports open yet. So now my laptop wants to go and establish that SSH connection. To do that, it's going to open up an outbound port on itself and assign some high number random port to it like 51233, and then it's going to send a request to the SSH server that is listening over port 22, which is the server's inbound port, and it's going to be destined for its IP address, which in this case is going to be assigned as 46.124.6313. Now, once the server receives this request on port 22, it has to respond to it. So it's going to send a packet of information back to my laptop's IP using the outbound port that was opened originally. In this case, that was port 51233. In reality, it's going to be a public-facing IP address of my router, but for our example here on the screen, I'm just going to use the private IP address of 192.168.1.45 just to keep our example clear. So at this point, my laptop has gone out and made the request to the server, and the server has answered that request. This now establishes a session between both of these devices, and we can then communicate back and forth as needed. Once that session is over, the connection is going to be closed, my laptop will close its outbound port because it's no longer needed, and the server will keep open its inbound port so that it can receive requests from the next user who wants to be able to use it. So now that we understand a little bit about how ports work in the real world, let's talk a little bit more about the ports themselves. In addition to being classified as either an inbound or outbound port, your port is also going to get a number, and then it's going to be assigned to one of three groups based on that number. Now, this number can be anywhere from 0 all the way up to 65,535. And this is a really big range, so it's actually been divided into three smaller groups. Our first group is known as the well-known ports. Now, a well-known port is any port that is numbered between 0 and 1023. Now, these are called well-known ports because they're designated by IANA, which is the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, and they're going to be able to assign it to a commonly used port and protocol that everyone can use. Now, for example, something like secure web browsing is something that we all use on a daily basis, and it uses HTTPS, which utilizes port 443. Another example of a really well-known port is actually port 23, which uses Telnet as its protocol. Both of these are considered to be well-known ports, and there are hundreds of others out there as well. Now, the second group we have is going to cover our ports from 1024 up to 49,151. This range is known as the registered port range because they all have to be used by vendors for their own proprietary protocols, and each vendor is going to register the number they want to use with IANA prior to being able to use them. For example, Microsoft has an SQL server that is using one of these registered ports. In this case, it's port 1433, which is the registered port for the Microsoft SQL server. Another good example of this is if you're going to use the proprietary Microsoft protocol known as RDP, or the Remote Desktop Protocol, because it operates over port 3389. Now, the third and final group we have is what's known as the dynamic and private ports. This uses the port range of 49,152 all the way up to the end of our port ranges, which is 65,535. These ports can be used by any application at any time without having to be registered first with IANA. Now, this range is usually going to be used by your client whenever it picks its own random high-number port for its application. Anytime it wants to have a temporary outbound connection, this is the range we're going to be using, this dynamic and private port range. It's also very commonly used in things like gaming, instant messaging, and chat too. Now, once each port is opened, you can now have communications to or from your device over that port using what is known as a protocol. Now, a protocol is a defined set of rules and conventions that governs the communication and data exchange between devices or systems that specifies the format and the sequence of messages that are going to be used for those communications. So, for example, when I mentioned that we could use port 443 for secure e-commerce website traffic, what I was really referring to is the fact that port 443 is being used with a protocol known as HTTPS, which is the Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure, and this is going to be used to send encrypted data to or from a given e-commerce web server using data that is supported over HTTPS connections like HTML. Now, for the rest of this video, we're going to spend just a little bit of time here going over each of the different well-known and registered ports that you should be familiar with as a cybersecurity professional. Now, for the exam, you are not going to get a question like, which of the following ports is used with the SSH protocol? That is too easy. You're not going to be able to select port 22 and get the right answer here. But you will get questions about why a secure web connection is being blocked by a firewall. And if you don't remember that secure web connections rely on port 443 to communicate, you're going to miss that question. Or you might get a question about RDP or SQL or Radius or something like that. And so all of these are things that are important for you to understand from a list of ports and protocols. And so we do need to take a little bit of time here to go over these well-known or registered ports, and you need to take some time to memorize 4 things for each given port. First, I want you to memorize the port number. Second, I want you to memorize the protocol used by that port by default. Third, I want you to know whether the protocol supports TCP or UDP connections. And fourth, I want you to know a basic description of what that port or protocol is going to be used for. All right, with all that said, let's get started with our memorization of ports. Now, port 21 is used for FTP or the File Transfer Protocol. FTP is going to be used to transfer files from a host to host, and it operates over port 21 using TCP. Port 22 is going to be used for 3 different things. It's used for SSH, SCP, and SFTP. SSH is going to provide us with secure remote terminal access and file transfer capabilities over port 22 using TCP. Essentially, SSH is used for remote control or remote access using a text-based environment to a remote server. SCP is going to provide you with secure copy functions over port 22, and SFTP will provide secure file transfers over port 22 as well. Next, we have port 23, which is going to be used for Telnet, and this is a protocol for remotely accessing network devices, and it operates over port 23 using TCP. Telnet is the older version of SSH, essentially. It's going to allow you to have remote control of a computer and be able to access it over a text-based connection, but it is unencrypted and considered to be insecure, so you should not be using it these days. But it is important to know that port 23 is Telnet because a lot of exam questions will focus on the ability of using remote control over port 23 and then ask you how you can better secure it. And the answer would be to close Telnet and then instead open an SSH port. Next one we have is port 25. Port 25 is used for SMTP or the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol and is responsible for sending emails over port 25 using TCP. Port 53 is going to be used for DNS or the Domain Name System. This is going to be used to translate domain names into IP addresses, and it functions over port 53 using both TCP and UDP connections. Port 69 is going to be used for TFTP, or the Trivial File Transfer Protocol, which is a simplified file transfer protocol that is often used with network-based operating systems. This is going to operate over port 69 using a UDP connection. Port 80 is the next one we have, and this is used for HTTP, or the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. HTTP is used for retrieving web pages, and it operates over page 80 using TCP in an unencrypted mode. Next, we have port 88, which is used for Kerberos. Kerberos is a network authentication protocol that operates over port 88 using UDP. Port 110 is used for POP3 or the Post Office Protocol version 3. POP3 is going to be responsible for retrieving email from a server, and it operates over port 110 using TCP connections. Port 119 is going to be used for NNTP or the Network News Transfer Protocol, and it's used for accessing news groups, and it operates over port 119 using TCP. Next, we have port 135, which is used for RPC or Remote Procedure Call Facilities. This is going to facilitate your communication between different system processes, and it operates over port 135 using TCP and UDP. Often, you will see RPC used as part of the Windows file sharing system. Next, we have ports 137, 138, and 139, which are all used for NetBIOS. NetBIOS is a network protocol suite, and it operates over ports 137, 138, and 139 using UDP and TCP. NetBIOS is used inside of a Windows domain environment for you to be able to share things like internal network names, as well as doing file and printer sharing in a local Windows environment. Next, we have port 143, which is used for IMAP. IMAP, or the Internet Message Access Protocol, allows for accessing email messages on a server and be able to operate over port 143 using a TCP connection. Next, we have port 161, which is used for SNMP, or the Simple Network Management Protocol, and SNMP is used to manage network devices, and it operates over port 161 using UDP. Port 162 is used for SNMP traps, and SNMP traps are responsible for sending SNMP trap messages, and it operates over port 162 using UDP. Next, we have port 389. Port 389 is going to be used for LDAP, or the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. This is going to be able to help you with directory services, and it operates over port 389 using TCP. Port 443 is going to be used for HTTPS, or the Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure, and this provides us with a secure web communication process that operates over port 443 using TCP. If you ever go to a website and it has that little lock in the corner, that means you're using an HTTPS connection. Next, we have port 445. Port 445 is going to be used for SMB, or the Server Message Block, and it's going to be used for file and printer sharing over a network, and operates using port 445 using TCP. Next, we have ports 465 and 587, which are going to be used for SMTPS. SMTPS is also known as SMTP Secure, and it provides us with secure SMTP communications to send our emails over port 465 or 587 using either SSL or TLS and a TCP connection. Next, we have port 514. Port 514 is used for syslog, and it's a protocol for sending log messages, and it operates over port 514 using a UDP connection. Next, we have port 636. Port 636 is used for LDAP Secure, or LDAPS. This allows us to have our LDAP directory communications happening over an SSL or TLS connection that is encrypted and operating over port 636 using a TCP connection. Next, we have port 993. Port 993 is used for IMAPs, or the Internet Message Access Protocol over SSL or TLS, and essentially this is the secure version of IMAP. This is going to be used to do the secure email retrieval over port 993 using a TCP connection. Next, we have port 995. Port 995 is used for POP3S. This is the Post Office Protocol version 3 over SSL or TLS. This allows us to have secure email retrieval using a POP3 protocol over port 995 using a TCP connection. Next, we have port 1433. Port 1433 is used for Microsoft SQL to facilitate communication with our Microsoft SQL server, and it operates over port 1433 using a TCP connection. Next, we have ports 1645 and 1646. Now, ports 1645 and 1646 are used for Radius using the TCP version of Radius, and Radius is a protocol for remote authentication, authorization, and accounting that operates over ports 1645 and 1646 using a TCP connection. Next, we have ports 1812 and 1813, which are going to be used for Radius when it uses a UDP session. Now, Radius, again, is going to function over ports 1812 and 1813 using UDP if we want to use UDP instead of TCP. Next, we have port 3389. Port 3389 is used by RDP, or the Remote Desktop Protocol, and it enables remote desktop access and operates over port 3389 using a TCP connection. And finally, we have port 6514, and port 6514 is going to be used for syslog TLS, which is a secure and encrypted version of syslog that operates over port 6514 using a TCP connection. Now, I know that was a lot of information I just provided in a very short amount of time. After watching this video once, I know you will not have all of these ports memorized that I just went through, so I do recommend you take the time to make a list and test yourself over and over again on these ports. This is critical information to answer a lot of questions on the exam, either directly or indirectly, as you're going to see on test day. Remember, you can rewatch this video as many times as you like to learn these different ports and protocols. Now, with that being said, I do like the old-fashioned method of making some flashcards to testing yourself on these ports and protocols. If you do that, I would write down the protocol on one side, like HTTP, and then I want you to flip it over, and on the other side, I want you to have the port number and the connection type, like port 80 TCP. This way, you'll be able to know what you have on both sides, and you could take the time to learn these ports and protocols before you take the exam. I promise you, taking the time to learn these ports and protocols is going to help you a lot come test day, as well as in your future career as a cybersecurity professional.